The truth about prison tattoos, what they really mean. The strip search ended the moment the ink was seen. The officer didn't shout. He didn't flinch. He just paused, long enough for the room to go quiet, and then reached for the radio. The man standing under the fluorescent lights felt it before he heard it. That change in the air. That shift from routine to risk. Because the tattoo on his shoulder wasn't decoration. It was a statement. Within minutes, he was moved. Not to medical. Not to intake. To a holding cage off the main corridor, where the walls were bare, the cameras unblinking, and the guards spoke in clipped phrases they reserved for trouble that hadn't started yet. No one told him what was wrong. He already knew. Inside prison walls, tattoos talk before you do. They announce who you are, where you've been, and what you're willing to do to survive. They can buy you protection, or a beating. They can save your life, or end it. And sometimes, they get you killed before your first night is over. The truth about prison tattoos isn't found on the internet or in pop culture. It lives in intake rooms, segregation units, and cell blocks where misreading a symbol can trigger consequences no one will warn you about. This is not a fashion language. It's a survival code. And once you're marked, there is no undo. The story begins the way many do, at intake. A man stepping into the system with ink he didn't earn. Maybe it came from the streets. Maybe it was a mistake made years earlier. Maybe it meant one thing outside and something far more dangerous inside. That's how people get hurt. In U.S. federal and state prisons, tattoos are read the way detectives read crime scenes. Not one symbol, but the placement. Not the image alone, but who's wearing it, where, and when. A teardrop near the eye doesn't mean the same thing in California as it does in Texas. A crown on the wrong shoulder can invite questions no one wants to answer. And questions inside prison are never neutral. Guards learn to read tattoos because they have to. Inmates learn because they don't get a second chance. A spider web creeping up the elbow can signal long stretches inside. Number codes etched into skin can link someone to a neighborhood, a set, or a history of violence that still demands loyalty. But the most dangerous tattoos aren't the obvious ones. They're the subtle ones. The tiny symbols hidden behind ears, under collars, on knuckles that curl inward when a fist closes. The marks that tell the right people exactly who you are, while staying invisible to everyone else. That's the first rule of prison ink. Visibility is optional. Meaning is not. Across the Atlantic, in the Russian prison system, tattoos once functioned as an entire underground hierarchy. During the Soviet era, prisons became societies with their own laws, and tattoos were the uniforms. Stars on shoulders weren't decoration, they were rank. Churches inked onto backs weren't religious, they counted sentences. Cats weren't pets, they marked thieves loyal to the code. And the code was unforgiving. Wearing a tattoo you hadn't earned wasn't just disrespect. It was fraud. And fraud was punished, sometimes brutally. Men were tested, interrogated, corrected. The wrong ink could turn a quiet sentence into a violent one overnight. Those systems didn't disappear. They evolved. In Latin America, tattoos became both identity and liability. In El Salvador and Mexico, gang tattoos once functioned as permanent membership cards, ink that declared allegiance to groups like MS-13 and Barrio 18. Entire bodies became canvases of commitment. Faces included. Then the governments adapted. Law enforcement began using tattoos as evidence. Tattoos became probable cause. Tattoos became targets. Suddenly, the same ink that once provided protection turned into a tracking system no one could escape. Members were forced to cover, alter, or remove markings under conditions that were anything but safe. Ink that was meant to bind became a liability that never faded. Back in the United States, the misunderstanding continued. Movies romanticized the imagery. Social media stripped the danger from the symbols. People copied designs without context, without permission, without understanding. Inside prison, ignorance is not a defense. A tattoo you got at 19 can define how you're treated at 40. A symbol you thought looked tough can lock you into conflicts you didn't choose. Ink doesn't expire. It accumulates meaning over time. And the system notices. Correctional intelligence units catalog tattoos the way they catalog weapons. photos, diagrams, databases. Officers don't need to ask what your ink means. They already have a theory. And once that theory exists, it shapes everything. Housing decisions, movement restrictions, who you're allowed to associate with. Sometimes the tattoo doesn't get you attacked. It isolates you. Isolation is its own punishment. But the real danger doesn't come from guards or databases. It comes from the people who live with you. The ones who read your skin the moment you step onto the tier. The ones who know what should and shouldn't be there. In prison, respect is currency. Tattoos can buy it or bankrupt you. That's why prison ink is earned. Slowly, carefully, under rules that change depending on geography, politics, and time. There is no universal dictionary. Only local interpretation. What protects you in one facility can end you in another. And transfer buses don't come with warnings. Chapter 1 isn't about glorifying the ink. It's about understanding the trap. The way symbols outlive intent. The way meaning shifts across walls. The way a single line of ink can speak louder than any explanation you try to offer. Because in prison, explanations sound like excuses. And excuses don't last. The man in the holding cage waited as the hours stretched. Guards passed without looking. Other inmates watched through cracks in doors, eyes tracing the outline of a tattoo that didn't belong where it was. Some symbols demand answers. Others demand action. When the door finally opened, it wasn't to release him. It was to move him, deeper, away from intake, toward a unit where the ink on his skin would be read by people who didn't ask questions first. And as he stepped forward, one guard leaned in just enough to be heard. "You might want to keep that covered," he said quietly. That was the only warning he would get. Because when the cell door closed behind him and the tier came alive with whispers and looks that lingered too long, the truth became clear. The tattoo he thought was harmless had already spoken. And whatever it said, someone was listening. The first rule he learned was silence. Not the kind that comes from fear, but the kind that keeps you breathing. In prison, asking why is a liability. So when eyes tracked the tattoo on his shoulder, when conversations paused as he passed, he didn't explain. He didn't joke. He didn't correct anyone. He kept his mouth shut. Because tattoos don't wait for context. They announce themselves immediately, and the people who understand them decide what they mean long before you speak. The tier had its own rhythm. Doors slammed on schedule. Footsteps echoed at predictable intervals. But beneath that routine, another system operated, one that paid attention to skin. New arrivals were assessed in seconds. Not by what they said, but by what they wore permanently. Ink was biography. A teardrop could be grief. It could be time served. It could be a promise. The wrong assumption could make you a target. The wrong correction could make it worse. That was the danger. Meaning was regional, political, and fluid. The same symbol shifted as power shifted. What meant mourning in one place meant violence in another. What once signaled loyalty now signaled defiance. Ink aged, but interpretation evolved. He learned that the hard way. The first conversation came late, when the lights dimmed and the tier quieted. A voice from the shadows. Curious. Not friendly. "Where'd you get that?" It wasn't a question looking for a story. It was a test. He answered carefully. Factual. No embellishment. He said where he'd been, not who he was. He left out the why. He let the words land without explanation. The silence afterward was worse than a threat. Across the block, other men listened without looking like they were listening. Someone coughed. Someone laughed at nothing. A chess piece slid across concrete. The sound carried. In prison, decisions are rarely announced. They're observed. That night he slept lightly. Not because he expected violence, but because he expected evaluation. The tattoo would be discussed when he wasn't present. It would be weighed against other signals. His posture, his associations, the way guards interacted with him. The way he moved through space. Ink was only the headline. Behavior confirmed the story. By morning, the atmosphere had shifted. Subtly. A seat at a table was no longer available. A line formed where none had existed before. Doors closed a second longer than usual. Nothing overt. Everything intentional. This was the stage where mistakes happened. where people tried to correct the record, where explanations turned into contradictions, where a single word could reframe a symbol and lock you into a conflict you didn't choose. He didn't take the bait. He remembered what an older inmate had told him during intake, advice passed quietly, without ceremony. "Your skin talks," the man had said. "Don't interrupt it." The advice was brutal but accurate. Across the system, officers tracked tattoos for different reasons. Not to punish, necessarily, but to predict. A sleeve that mapped affiliations could change housing assignments. A fresh marking could signal a shift in allegiance. A covered tattoo could be a warning sign, something new, something volatile. Correctional intelligence units cataloged ink the way they cataloged gangs. Not every tattoo mattered, but enough of them did that patterns emerged. Patterns shaped decisions, and decisions shaped outcomes. In some facilities, a visible symbol meant protection. In others, it meant isolation. The same ink could get you placed with allies, or deliberately separated from them to prevent violence. Tattoos were leverage. The system used them quietly, efficiently, and without apology. But the system didn't control everything. In Russia's prisons, tattoos had once governed life more strictly than guards. During the Soviet era, camps became kingdoms with their own laws, and tattoos were passports. Stars on shoulders marked authority that guards often respected. Churches counted sentences. Barbed wire around wrists signaled no parole. The wrong tattoo wasn't just offensive. It was dangerous. Men were tested publicly, made to explain symbols they hadn't earned, forced to remove or alter ink under conditions that scarred bodies and reputations alike. Ink was truth, and truth was enforced. Those traditions didn't vanish with the Soviet Union. They fractured, migrated, and adapted. The code survived because it worked. It organized chaos. It rewarded loyalty. It punished fraud. Fraud was the worst offense. In Latin America, the cycle repeated differently. Tattoos once unified. Then they betrayed. Governments adapted faster than gangs expected, turning visibility into vulnerability. Ink that once signaled belonging became evidence. Faces that once demanded respect now triggered arrests. Members adapted by covering, burning, or cutting away symbols. The methods were crude. The risks were constant. Removal didn't erase memory. It created suspicion. A scar told a story too. There was no winning, only managing exposure. Back on the tier, the consequences arrived without ceremony. He was assigned a new cellmate. Not hostile, not friendly, neutral. The kind of neutral that watched carefully and spoke sparingly. The kind assigned deliberately. "You keep it covered," the cellmate said one night, nodding toward the tattoo. Not a suggestion. A condition. He nodded back. Covering ink didn't make it disappear. It only delayed interpretation. Eventually, someone would see it. Showers, medical, searches. But delay mattered. Delay bought time to establish a different narrative through behavior. In prison, reputation can outrun ink if you're careful. But not always. The real danger wasn't confrontation. It was correction. Correction is when someone decides your tattoo means something specific and expects you to live up to it. Correction is when neutrality ends. When silence is interpreted as consent. When a symbol becomes an obligation. That was the line he feared crossing. Because obligations don't come with options. Across the block, another man crossed that line without realizing it. New ink, poorly done, placed wrong. A symbol borrowed from a culture he didn't belong to. It took days, not minutes, for the response to come. It was quiet. Administrative. He was moved. Later, the tier learned why. He hadn't been beaten. He'd been educated. The tattoo was altered in a way that marked him permanently, corrected, but also diminished. A visible lesson. A warning that spread faster than rumors. That was the power of prison tattoos. They didn't just communicate identity. They enforced hierarchy. And hierarchy doesn't need constant violence to work. It needs memory. The guards knew this. They watched dynamics shift and adjusted accordingly. A tattoo sparked tension. A schedule changed. A symbol suggested alliance. Housing shifted. The system didn't take sides. It mitigated risk. Sometimes, mitigation looked like punishment. The man with the tattoo began receiving different looks from staff. Not hostile. Evaluative. The kind reserved for variables. He wasn't accused of anything. He wasn't written up. But his movement was restricted subtly. Programs delayed. Transfers postponed. Ink had consequences beyond the tier. That's when the second truth emerged. Tattoos don't just speak to inmates. They speak to institutions. A marking can change how long you wait, where you're placed, who you're allowed to see. In a system built on classification, ink is data. And data drives decisions without emotion. He learned to live with that. Days passed. Then weeks. The tattoo faded into the background. Not because it was forgotten, but because it was accounted for. A conclusion had been reached. A quiet agreement formed. He would be allowed to exist without escalation as long as nothing changed. Stability in prison is fragile. One event can reset everything. It happened during a routine transfer. A bus ride. A new facility. New geography. New interpretation. What protected him before now meant something else entirely. The moment he stepped off the bus, eyes scanned him with fresh context. The tattoo was seen again, not as it had been, but as it was now understood locally. Different power structures. Different alliances. Different rules. That's when he realized the most dangerous thing about prison tattoos. They don't stay where you got them. Ink travels. Meaning mutates. And no one gives you a dictionary when you arrive. The first night in the new unit, a man approached him, not aggressively, not quietly. Officially. He spoke like someone delivering terms, not threats. "You wear that," he said, gesturing with his chin. "You represent something here." The words landed heavy. Representation meant expectation. Expectation meant obligation. Obligation meant risk. He asked the only safe question. "What if I don't?" The man smiled without warmth. "Then someone decides for you." That was the cliff. Chapter 2 wasn't about survival yet. It was about choice narrowing. About realizing that ink doesn't just tell your past, it drafts your future. That you can be careful and still be trapped. Silent and still implicated. Because prison tattoos don't care what you intended. They care what others need them to mean. And as the night settled in and the tears quiet grew tense again, one thing was clear. The tattoo had crossed facilities. Now it was crossing lines. And whatever decision came next wouldn't be reversible. The decision came without a meeting. No announcement. No threat. Just a change in gravity around him. Conversations stopped when he approached. Eyes lingered longer. The tattoo, once a background concern, had become foreground again, reframed by the new unit's rules. This was how it always happened. Prison tattoos didn't cause violence directly. They invited interpretation. And interpretation, inside prison, was power. The man who had spoken to him the night before wasn't a bully or a shot caller in the loud sense. He was worse. He was administrative. The kind of inmate who didn't need to raise his voice because the structure already agreed with him. "You don't get to be neutral with that ink," he'd said. That was the truth no one outside prison ever understood. Neutrality is a luxury of people without markings. Over the next few days, the pressure didn't escalate, it clarified. He was asked to sit at certain tables. To stand in certain places during count. To avoid others. None of it was framed as force. It was framed as alignment. Alignment meant safety. Refusal meant unpredictability. Unpredictability is what gets people removed, or worse. The tattoo had become a vote cast on his behalf. That's the final function of prison ink. Not identity, not history, not memory, but assignment. Across the unit, other men carried their own assignments. Some wore them openly. Others hid theirs under layers of scar tissue and regret. A man with a spider web on his elbow scrubbed trays in the kitchen, counting years in quiet. Another with numbers etched into his knuckles never spoke above a whisper but was never bothered. Hierarchy was visible if you knew how to read it. Guards read it too. Classification officers watched interactions the way chess players watch boards. Who stood where? Who deferred? Who didn't need to ask permission? Tattoos were not determinative, but they were predictive. They told the system where stress might accumulate. And stress is what institutions fear most. That's why tattoos followed you long after release. The real twist, the one no one expects, is that prison ink doesn't end at the gate. It leaks outward. Employers see it. Police remember it. Border agents notice it. A tattoo earned for survival becomes a permanent annotation on your life. Even covered, it exists. Even removed, it leaves residue. Men who leave prison often believe the hardest part is behind them. But the ink doesn't believe in endings. It carries forward meanings forged in environments that don't care about second chances. A crown once meant power. Now it means suspicion. A star once meant rank. Now it means monitoring. A number once meant belonging. Now it means history. Law enforcement agencies maintain tattoo databases not to punish, but to connect dots. Ink becomes metadata, a visual shorthand for networks, past and present. Officers are trained not to assume, but assumptions still shape encounters. The system doesn't forget symbols. Neither do the people who lived under them. Years later, the man would be released. No escort. No ceremony. Just paperwork and a gate that opened outward. He would walk into daylight carrying nothing but a small bag and a body that still spoke a language he no longer wanted to use. Outside, no one would ask him about the tattoo directly. They didn't have to. Interviews ended early. Background checks stalled. Casual conversations shifted when sleeves rode up or collars slipped. The same mark that once demanded allegiance now demanded explanation. Explanation is exhausting. He would learn to dress around it, to position himself carefully, to manage first impressions with precision born from years of reading rooms. He would learn that even freedom had tears, and tattoos still sorted you into them. That is the final cruelty of prison ink. It outlives the prison. For some, the tattoo remains a badge of survival. For others, a relic they can't fully shed. For many, it's both at once, a reminder of what they endured and a barrier to what comes next. Before this story blows past the walls they said were unbreakable, hit subscribe, tap like, and tell me in the comments, could this happen again?